Imagine a world where the greatest empire collapsed, not because of barbarians or plague, but because they ignored a single microscopic truth. They possessed the key to infinite growth, tucked away in the shadows of a dusty library, yet they chose the comfort of their slow decline. That key? It was less than a breath. It was less than a whisper. It was the absence of value, a single concept that dictated the rise and fall of every financial dynasty, every technological leap we now take for granted. What if I told you the apocalypse began not with fire, but with zero? This is not a story of massive armies clashing beneath crimson flags, nor is it the tale of a sudden, catastrophic meteor strike. This is the quiet, terrifying history of a seed so small, so subtle in its presence, that for thousands of years, civilizations stared directly at it and saw only nothingness. They saw a hole, they saw the void, and because they could not recognize the profound seismic power held within that void, they failed, utterly and magnificently. Welcome back to Historia, where we dig into the mysteries hidden in the bedrock of civilization. Tonight, we unearth the true cost of impatience and the staggering reward of those who understood that the greatest giants always begin as the most delicate sprouts. The saga we follow begins long before written history, in the muddy, fertile crescent where the first accountants, the priests of Sumer, began the impossible task of quantifying chaos. They were brilliant. They developed a positional system, the foundation of all modern mathematics. But they faced an agonizing, constant limitation. They had no way to mark an empty column within a complex number. They had quantities, yes. They had the concept of 1, 2, 3. They had the physical reality of 3 goats and 2 baskets. But what did you have when the designated space for the hundreds column was empty? You had confusion. You had error. You had a system that collapsed under its own weight the moment true complexity was required. The Romans, the masters of engineering and organization, cemented this mathematical impotence with their system of IVXL. They built roads that span continents, aqueducts that defy time, and monuments that scream permanence. But try multiplying XLVI by CXXI using only Roman numerals. The operation devolves into a desperate, sprawling architectural project, requiring massive abacuses and highly trained scribes, a luxury only the wealthy elite could afford. Calculation was not a fluid, democratic process. It was an esoteric ritual. And when calculation is difficult, innovation stalls. When the fundamental tools of measuring progress are blunt and cumbersome, the civilization becomes blunt and cumbersome. Their magnificent empire, spanning 1,000 years, was held captive by the simple fact that they could not conceptualize nothingness as something essential. The seed was dormant. It lay waiting, unrecognized, beneath the towering achievements of classical civilization. A tiny germ of potential encased in the stony silence of intellectual arrogance. Now, imagine the moment of inception. Travel east, far past the dust and marble of the Mediterranean, into the spiritual heart of the Indian subcontinent. Here, in the quiet discipline of philosophical thought, the concept of the void, shunya, was not terrifying. It was foundational. If the Western mind demanded concrete reality, the Eastern mind embraced the philosophical necessity of absence. If existence demanded a full circle, then the point of origin, the place where measurement began, had to be symbolized. Somewhere between the 5th and 9th centuries, in a world utterly unconcerned with the dying echoes of Rome, the revolutionary act occurred. A scribe, a mathematician, or perhaps a temple priest took the circle that symbolized the cosmic void and gave it a practical function. They called it Bindu, the dot, and they used it to hold.
They used it to differentiate 46 from 406. This was the seed, a tiny dot, a simple circle, but it was the key that unlocked infinity. When zero arrived, numbers gained wings. Suddenly, calculations that took days could be performed in minutes. Anyone, even a child, could grasp the logic of multiplication and division, operations previously reserved for the priesthood of mathematics. This seemingly insignificant invention, this quiet declaration that nothing could hold everything, was the catalyst for the entire scientific revolution yet to come. But the world was not ready to receive this gift. The distance between the banks of the Ganges and the markets of Venice was not just geographical. It was philosophical, political, and religiously guarded. The seed had sprouted, yes, but its growth would be agonizingly slow, a testament to the immense, crushing inertia of human tradition and fear. For 500 years, the secret remained largely contained within the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars in Baghdad, drawing heavily on Indian sources, recognized the profound power of the zero and the Hindu-Arabic numeral system. Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, popularized its use. Suddenly, algebra flourished, astronomy leaped forward, trade became exponentially more efficient. The great caliphates built empires of knowledge and wealth on calculations that the stagnant, feudal kingdoms of Europe simply could not manage. The Crusaders, often depicted as purely martial figures, were, in reality, conduits. They were the accidental messengers who stumbled into the gleaming, complex cities of the Middle East and saw not just wealth, but an utterly superior intellectual engine powering that wealth. They saw calculations being performed on tablet tops with ease, where their own financial transactions required rooms full of clumsy tally sticks and abacuses. The transmission of the seed was not peaceful. It was a contested infiltration. In the late 12th century, the system began to leak into Europe, often through trade routes in Spain and Sicily. The man most famously credited with accelerating this transmission was Leonardo of Pisa, known as Fibonacci. Traveling through North Africa with his merchant father, Fibonacci witnessed the efficiency of the Arabic system. He grasped immediately that it was the future. In 1202, he published Liber Abaci, the Book of Calculation, a text intended to educate European merchants and scholars on this new revolutionary method. The reaction was immediate, dramatic, and violently negative. The established order, the powerful guild of abacists, the church authorities who favored Roman tradition, and the local governments who feared disruption, saw the introduction of the zero and its associated numerals not as progress, but as dangerous heresy. Why? Because the system was too easy, because it was too fast, because it allowed complex transactions to be recorded swiftly and, crucially, subtly. The powerful elites of finance operated in plain sight, using the complicated, slow Roman system, which allowed them to obscure their accounting and maintain control. The new Hindu-Arabic numerals were called ciphering, derived from the Arabic sifr, meaning empty or zero. This act of ciphering was immediately associated with secret messages, fraudulent accounting, and black magic. Florence and other powerful city-states in Italy issued bans against the use of the new numerals in official documents. They feared the deception. They feared the democratization of knowledge. They feared the small, quiet circle that could hold infinite deception. Imagine the patience required in this moment. The scholars, the quiet, persistent intellectuals who knew they held the key to lifting their civilization from the Dark Ages, were forced to operate in the shadows. They taught the new math in secret, using it primarily for complex, theoretical problems, hiding its practical application. Application of the suspicious eyes of the magistrates. The seed was under siege. It had broken the surface, but the harsh climate of cultural resistance threatened to freeze its growth entirely. Centuries passed in this tense standoff. Europe was technologically capable of inventing the printing press, building Gothic cathedrals, and navigating vast oceans. But its fundamental language of quantification remained shackled by ancient, cumbersome tools. The tension became unbearable. Society was a taut wire, strung between an impossible demand for growth and an insufficient system of calculation. How do you fund a global exploration using an abacus? How do you calculate complex interest rates for emerging capitalist ventures when every multiplication is a days-long exercise? The answer is, you don't. You stagnate. And stagnation in the face of burgeoning global opportunity is the true definition of failure. The small seed of zero, which had traveled thousands of miles and endured hundreds of years of rejection, finally began to break through the intellectual pavements around the 15th century. It wasn't philosophical acceptance that drove the change. It was pure, brutal commercial necessity. The rise of massive, centralized nation-states required sophisticated taxation. The burgeoning global trade demanded accurate bookkeeping and complex insurance calculations across massive supply chains. Merchants who adopted the zero system simply outcompeted those who clung to the Roman ways. A merchant using the old system might make one significant calculation a day. A merchant using the cipher could perform 50. The patience of the scholars, the quiet, determined persistence of the mathematicians who had guarded this secret, finally paid off. When the practical advantage became too significant to ignore, the bands crumbled. The fear of the void was replaced by the fever of profit. The single, tiny concept of absence became the foundation of modern finance, the engine
Of the Renaissance, and the invisible structure supporting the age of exploration. Think about the sheer scale of that transformation. One small character, less than a pen stroke, changed the entire trajectory of human wealth and warfare. Without zero, there is no calculus. Without calculus, there is no modern physics. Without modern physics, there are no rockets, no satellites, no global communication. The small seed grew into the towering tree of modernity. But the story does not end with a triumphant victory for reason. The history of the seed is also a history of immense, calculated patience used for purposes far darker than trade. The patience that was required to protect zero, the quiet conviction that one day this truth would be needed, is mirrored in the patience of those who wielded the truth for ultimate power. We often look at historical events, the collapse of empires, the sudden technological leaps, as explosions of singular energy. But our investigation reveals that these explosions are merely the moments when the slow, invisible accumulation of energy finally breaches the surface. It is the patience that defines the outcome. Now we shift our focus from mathematics to a literal seed, a biological one. In the early 19th century, in a remote, politically sensitive region of South America, a different kind of patience was being exercised. The world was gripped by the Industrial Revolution, and one commodity was rapidly becoming more valuable than gold or spice: rubber. The Amazonian rubber tree, Hevea brasiliensis, was the single natural source of the elastic material that was revolutionizing everything from machinery belts to waterproof clothing. The demand was insatiable. The city of Manaus, built in the heart of the Brazilian jungle, became an architectural masterpiece funded by rubber wealth, a testament to the concentrated power derived from a single type of biological growth. Brazil had a monopoly, fiercely protected by laws that made the Hevea seeds or live cuttings a crime punishable by death. They understood the power of their seed. They were exercising their own intense patience, waiting for the global economy to fully bind itself to their resource before delivering the final crushing blow of price control. But in history, power rarely resides solely in the hands of the arrogant. Patience is a weapon wielded by the unseen. Enter Henry Wickham, a name largely forgotten by history, but a man who understood the profound potential of a small, hidden transfer. Wickham was an English adventurer, a planter, and, crucially, a man who possessed the extreme patience necessary for high-stakes espionage. In 1876, operating under the guise of an American botanist studying local flora, Wickham meticulously collected 70,000 seeds of the prized Hevea brasiliensis. He was not looking for a few samples. He was looking for a biological critical mass. 70,000 tiny, insignificant seeds, each smaller than a thumbnail, were carefully dried and packed into baskets, labeled falsely as rare botanical specimens for Queen Victoria's Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. The risk was astronomical. Detection meant death and international incident. Wickham successfully bribed local authorities, chartered a swift steamer, the SS Amazonas, and, in a moment that hinged entirely on his own cool deception and the carelessness of a few river guards, slipped the 70,000 seeds out of Brazil. The journey was long and perilous. The seeds, requiring specific conditions to germinate, were a race against biological decay. Wickham's patience was not passive. It was the active, vigilant nursing of a critical payload across an entire ocean. Upon arrival at Kew Gardens, the seeds were immediately planted in the hothouses under the strict supervision of Sir Joseph Hooker. Of the 70,000 seeds, only about 2,700 successfully germinated. This is the key to understanding the seed of patience. Success is rarely 100%. It is the
Tenacious focus on the surviving percentage that matters. Those 2,700 seedlings were the ultimate biological bomb. They were nurtured in England, then shipped to Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, and Singapore, where the climatic conditions were ideal for their cultivation on massive, newly cleared plantations. The Brazilian rubber empire, which had taken centuries to establish and was built on the foundation of geographic monopoly and fierce protection, collapsed in just 3 decades. It was not defeated by a rival army, but by 2,700 carefully transplanted saplings, which themselves were born from 70,000 smuggled seeds. The small seed became a multinational industrial giant, transforming Southeast Asia and fueling the machine age. Manaus, the glittering city in the jungle, became a phantom town almost overnight, its grand opera house a monument to the fatal arrogance of short-sighted protectionism. The story of the rubber seed teaches us a chilling lesson about asymmetrical power. The greatest disruptive force in history is often the smallest thing transferred with the greatest patience. It is the invisible lever that can move the entire world. But let us return to the nature of mystery and history. The examples of zero and the rubber seed illustrate the principle of exponential consequence. But what happens when the item is not a concept or a plant, but an object designed specifically to facilitate maximum patient control? What happens when the seed is designed to ensure that a select few always know the path ahead? We must now turn our attention to the long game played by hidden orders, those secretive institutions that truly grasp the multi-generational effort required to guide or misguide human development. We are searching for the master document, the forgotten charter, or the single overlooked artifact that, through centuries of careful stewardship, dictated the modern world order. This artifact, if it exists, is not meant to be found in a museum or a police department.
history book. It is the seed of institutional memory, the quiet knowledge that allows a group to make decisions now that will only pay dividends 5 generations hence. Think of the Masonic orders, the Rosicrucians, or the various secret societies rumored to influence political outcomes. Their power, if real, does not come from rituals or robes, but from their temporal advantage. While governments operate on 4-year election cycles and businesses plan quarterly, these deep structures plan on the scale of millennia. Imagine a single hermetically sealed copper scroll, hidden deep beneath the ruins of an ancient temple, perhaps in Qumran or Petra. This scroll does not contain apocalyptic prophecy or lost treasure maps. Instead, it contains a simple, brutally accurate socioeconomic model. A prediction based on complex cycles and human behavior, detailing the precise moments in history when specific innovations, such as zero or the controlled proliferation of a specific agricultural strain, would have maximum leverage. The mystery is not what they knew, but when they knew it, and how they managed to wait. The scroll, let us call it the Chronos cipher, dictates that the release of knowledge must be timed with agonizing precision. Release zero too early, and the superstitious world burns the mathematicians as heretics, killing the concept before it roots. Release it too late, and the civilization collapses into irreversible darkness. The timing, the moment of rupture, is everything. The keepers of the Chronos cipher, let us hypothesize a historical group, the Custodes Temporis, did not seek overt power. They sought the quiet, subtle power of being the only entity capable of calculating history's tipping points. Their patience was the strategic deployment of inaction. They waited, not for opportunity to arise, but until opportunity reached its peak ripeness. Consider the invention of the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg's innovation in the mid-15th century did not change the world overnight.
For years, printing remained a localized, expensive, and specialized craft. The seed of communication needed the right soil and the right climate. What if the custodes temporis, armed with the cipher's predictions, understood that the real revolution would only begin when two conditions were met? First, the widespread adoption of the simplified zero calculation system, and second, the simultaneous rise of widespread lay literacy driven by religious upheaval. The printing press was merely the hardware. The seed of widespread, revolutionary communication only truly sprouted when the intellectual infrastructure, the calculation ease, and the motivational necessity was in place. The custodes, knowing the timing, could ensure resources, patronage, and distribution were subtly optimized just before the tipping point. This suggests that the great men of history, the scientific pioneers, the revolutionary thinkers, were not merely singular geniuses, but the inevitable outcomes of a multi-century gardening project. They were the perfect flowers that bloomed only because the hidden patient hands ensured the soil was precisely mixed and the sunlight perfectly calibrated. We now enter the territory of modern technological growth. If the past was shaped by the seed of zero and the rubber tree, what is the microscopic seed defining our current age? It is the algorithm. Specifically, the tiny, seemingly innocuous lines of code that dictate the flow of information and the structure of our social interactions. Think of the initial moment of Facebook or Google. They began as small, often naive ideas, sometimes started in college dorm rooms or garages. The seed was simple: connect people or organize information. Small, harmless, even beneficial. But the custodes temporis, or their modern equivalent, the masters of temporal strategy, understood the power of the network effect. They knew that patience applied not to decades, but to data.
Accumulation. The initial phase required immense restraint, avoiding monetization and overt control, allowing the seed to spread purely through utility and addiction. The giant that has grown from this seed is not a physical empire, but an empire of attention and behavior. The patience of the algorithm is terrifyingly effective. It waits for years, learning your habits, correlating your decisions, mapping your desires. Every click, every pause, every purchase is fed into the system. And the system, fueled by this vast, patient accumulation of personal data, becomes the most powerful predictive tool in human history. A modern digital chrono cipher operating in real time. The small seed of code planted 20 years ago has grown into a vast shadow infrastructure that shapes elections, controls market sentiments, and dictates the very definition of truth. And this brings us to the ultimate mystery of the seed of patience. If something small becomes giant, there is an inescapable paradox. The moment the small thing becomes giant, it becomes visible, powerful, and therefore vulnerable to attack. The custodes temporis, the ancient keepers of the chronocipher, understood that the greatest power resides in the object before it becomes giant, when it is small, defensible, and unnoticed. The true exercise of strategic patience, therefore, is maintaining a perpetual state of invisibility while orchestrating massive effects. Ask yourself, if the invention of zero was the seed that created the age of reason, what is the contemporary zero that is currently being carefully nurtured, completely out of sight, destined to shatter our current reality? It cannot be artificial intelligence itself, because AI is already giant, visible, and contested. It cannot be space travel for the same reason. The next great seed must be something fundamental, conceptual, and currently dismissed as insignificant. Perhaps it is a tiny, forgotten flaw in the global financial system. A system or loophole that has been deliberately maintained and cultivated by an entity planning a radical global reset. A flaw so small that generations of auditors have simply patched around it, believing it to be a negligible error, yet knowing that if triggered at the perfect predicted moment, it could halt all capital transfer on Earth. That is the true power of the small seed. It is the defect carefully preserved until it is strong enough to consume the system it inhabits. Or perhaps the seed is located not in technology, but in biology, specifically in the concept of synthetic memory. Imagine a minute pharmaceutical agent,
a designer molecule that does not treat illness, but instead precisely edits the trauma of history from a population's collective consciousness. A tiny pill requiring years of perfect quiet development, ready to be introduced into the water supply of a major global power at the exact moment civil unrest threatens the established order. The patience required to develop a weapon of forgetting is immense, but the resulting stability for the controlling power would be absolute. The lesson of the small becoming giant is this: every global crisis you witness, every revolution, every boom and bust is merely the harvesting of a plant that was sown decades or centuries earlier. The chaos you see is the necessary, sometimes agonizing consequence of someone else's decades-long commitment to a single, tiny act of creation or concealment. The most terrifying thing about the seed of patience is that we are all, right now, standing in the shadow of giants that began as whispers we ignored. We are living the consequences of decisions made by people who died 100 years before we were born. People who recognize that the path to ultimate power is paved not with gold, but with the quiet, persistent, almost devotional act of waiting. Their power lies in the understanding that the seed of truth is delicate, and its exposure must.
They know that impatience leads to premature revelation and destruction, while true patience ensures that when the time comes, the growth is inevitable, overwhelming, and irreversible. The true history of humanity is the silent story of these cultivated moments. The empires rise and fall based on their relationship with the small, quiet, powerful truths they inherit. The ancient Roman failure was a failure of numerical patience, a refusal to accept the simplicity of zero. The Brazilian catastrophe was a failure of biological patience, a refusal to guard their seed long enough against the determined patience of their rivals. And our current reality? Our digital, interconnected, overwhelmingly complex reality. It is the result of someone's immense strategic patience in cultivating the perfect seed of control. They waited until the world was so dependent on the interconnected web of data, until the network effect was absolute, before they began the final subtle harvest. We have explored the concept, the object, and the historical pattern. We must now conclude with the core truth that binds all these histories together. The seed itself is inert. The zero is just a symbol. The rubber seed is just a plant. The algorithm is just a formula. What makes them giant is the human will focused on a multi-generational outcome. It is the devotional, almost religious commitment to a long-term goal that gives the small thing its terrifying exponential power. And if that long-term goal is the maintenance of an invisible ruling class, then their ultimate weapon is not force, but the strategic distribution of crucial, game-changing information, the timed release of the seed. They create the problems we struggle to solve because they know the solution already, and they simply wait until our desperation makes us willing to accept their cure, regardless of the cost to our freedom. So, as you step away from this account,
The most significant events of your life, the profound shifts in global power, the sudden collapses and incredible breakthroughs, are merely the fruit of a slow, patient growth that began in the dark. The question is not what the next great shift will be, but rather, who is planting the seed right now, and what terrifying giant is currently being prepared in the quiet, patient shadows of our present moment. The truth is always small at first, and it is always hidden from the gaze of the impatient. If you
error
stop
in the
now,
satellite
you will never
navigation
know the
system
final
that was
truth about the
programmed to
tiny
wait for
error
a
in the
specific
satellite
solar
navigation
flare,
system
an
that
error
was
that will
programmed
allow
to
one
wait for
country
a
to blind
specific
the
solar
world
flare.
as shipping
An
routes
error
in the
that will
span
allow
of
one
3
country
minutes,
to
an
blind
error
the world's
planted by a
shipping routes in
single
the span of
disgruntled
3
engineer
minutes.
30
An
years
error
ago,
planted by a
an error that
single
is about
disgruntled
to
engineer
bloom into
30 years
global
ago.
catastrophe.
An error that is about to bloom into global catastrophe.